In between 4 and 3, 2, 1, I'll tell you the purpose of the demo and what's going to happen after dinner in the synthesis lecture.
Devin's going to eat so that he doesn't have to do this again.
Okay, so the debate that you are about to see will be with different positions than you saw the original demo debate with. These positions are going to allow you to see in action a lot of things you've been working on in labs and a lot of things you've been working on in the casing series. So we're going to watch the debate. I'm going to give you some commentary on the round as it's going on. And then after dinner, we're going to have the synthesis lecture. And the point of that is to apply all of the casing series to an examination of this debate. So it's crucial that you guys flow well, because we're going to be, the whole lecture after dinner is going to be focused on what's about to happen in the next 40 minutes or so, to an hour and a half. Okay.
Is everyone ready? Good. I affirm. Deadly force is force intended to cause or that carries a substantial risk of causing death. Myersfield explains what repeated domestic violence is. Violence that has a characteristic of repeated intensity is distinct from violence that occurs infrequently and which is not sufficiently severe to cause either long-term physical damage or induce fear regarding the recurrence of the violence. The repetitive component does not only relate to the act of harm itself, the threat of violence may be as destructive as the act of violence. Prefer this definition since it defines repeated domestic violence as a term of art. When people in the field discuss repeated domestic violence, they don't just mean more than one instance. Instead, they mean violence that is consistently recurring with psychological damage upon the victim. I value morality derived from the evaluative term of the resolution. There are 4 justifications for the affirmative criterion of consistency with the right to self-defense. The first justification is that any moral theory is premised upon some worth of humans, which can only be upheld through ensuring the right to self-defense. Wallerstein 1 explains, self-defense must be an absolute right because without a right to self-defense, the right not to be killed can hardly be regarded as a right as it provides its owner no effective tools to protect it. It also has an additional role in the defense against a threat to autonomy that is generated by the fear and instability that the lack of such a right would bring about. One of the reasons we value life is because it is a necessary precondition to the possibility of autonomy of pursuing various personal and communal goals. Thus, the right to self-defense can be partly explained by reason of its implications for autonomy. All persons must be able to defend themselves because if they were forced to allow their worth to be subjugated through physical or psychological means, they devalue the sanctity of human worth, which destroys the basis of any moral system. Second, self-defense is a prerequisite to moral systems since the lack of such a right excludes the ability to check violations of moral rules. Morality would then permit the exclusion of victims' voices and violation of its own rules of conduct, since victims are denied the ability to defend moral rules limiting abuse. Moral systems would collapse since morality would permit violations of its own moral codes. Thus, the very idea of morality requires a right to self-defense. Third, even if the government has a monopoly on violence, it only has such a monopoly in order to better protect individuals' fundamental rights. We give up our right to kill in order to protect our right not to be killed. However, at the point where the state fails in its duty to protect rights, the social contract is broken and citizens have the right to violence to protect themselves. 4. My criterion is preferable to others because it is justified under both utilitarian and deontological frameworks. Under utilitarian calculus, the absence of a right to self-defense leaves rights violations unchecked in instances in which government or society isn't looking, preventing people from achieving the greatest good. Moreover, under a deontological framework, the affirmation of a right to self-defense can be willed universally for all moral beings and is good purely based on the intent. The implication is that you prefer the protection of a right to self-defense over all other standards because it links to any meta-ethical framework. Before I go on to my contentions, I have one observation about how the criterion works. Moral permissibility regarding self-defense can only be judged from the subjective view of the person defending themselves. This is true because the victim is the only one with accurate knowledge of a situation and how to escape it. Even if objective rules say another action is preferable, they are meaningless if the agent thinks them impossible. For instance, objectively, shooting an abuser in the legs may immobilize them and be sufficient to stop an attack, but if the victim cannot aim to hit the legs, then that method is meaningless in self-defense. Thus, Arguments that attempt to apply external standards to the victim's action or seek to prove that other alternatives are available are inconsistent with the moral justification of self-defense, which is an attempt to empower the individual to defend against moral harm based on their judgment. Contention 1. Abused women who kill only do so in extreme circumstances. This is empirically confirmed. Saunders explains. Studies of abused women who kill indicate that they often feel hopelessly trapped in a desperate situation from which they see no avenue of safe escape. Battered women who kill are more likely to suffer more frequent assaults and receive more severe injuries, to be raped by their partners, and be threatened with death by their partners. The homicide occurs as an attempt to prevent an attack they believe to be imminent and life-threatening or during a violent assault. Minimally, deadly force is justified when the abuser is about to seriously maim the victim, since that's the only way the victim can defend themselves. Contention 2. Even victims who are not immediately being physically attacked suffer harm proportional to death. Subpoint A. Many suffer psychological harm that is equivalent to death. Ewing explains. Though these women may not be faced with a choice of killing or being killed, many are confronted with a dilemma nearly as dreadful. Unable to recognize any viable means of escape from the battery, they face the choice of killing their batterers or being reduced to a psychological state in which their continued existence will have little, if any, meaning. The result is a life hardly worth living. The only reason life is worthwhile is that the person finds value in it. Constant psychological harm destroys that reason. Even if proportionality is relevant, deadly force is justified, since psychological trauma and fear is just as bad as death, so the victim is justified in killing their abuser. Subpoint B. The objective risk of death is also very real. Kuhn quantifies the harm. Battering is distorted by imminence. Imminence reflects subjective social norms that women should leave relationships before violence takes place. Yet, requiring retreat exposes women to greater abuse. Separation increases battering, and according to the Department of Justice, 75% of assaults occur when the abused is divorced or separated from the abuser. Another indicates 45% of murders arise out of a man's rage over impending estrangement. Women separated from their spouses are 25 times more likely to be attacked than married women. This has two impacts. First, victims do not have the ability to leave the situation. They are left with the decision between losing their own lives or taking those of their abusers. This is a situation specific to domestic violence, which is why other regular directions of proportionality do not apply. Second, since domestic violence is cyclical, victims know the harm is imminent and most likely will escalate, so they are justified in using deadly force in self-defense. Contention 3. Most victims of domestic abuse have no alternatives. The United Nations explains that repeated domestic violence is widespread in developing countries, and many victims do not have legal protection. The United Nations writes, based on the prevalence surveys from 70 countries, up to 60% of women have experienced physical or sexual violence in their lifetimes. 603 million women and girls continue to live in countries where there is no specific legal protection from domestic violence. Worldwide, 2.6 billion women and girls live in countries where rape within marriage is not explicitly criminalized. Therefore, many victims of domestic violence are not protected by the state. If the government cannot protect them, they must protect themselves. Thus, use of deadly force by victims of domestic abuse is an exercise of the right to self-defense, is thus permissible. As such, I affirm the resolution and stand open for cross-examination.
So your conception of morality says that in order to be moral, you have to act in self-defense, correct?
Well, it would be moral to act in self-defense, sure.
Okay, how do we know when an individual is acting in self-defense?
Well, that's what the argument directly above the contention is for. There are certain considerations that are relevant when making that determination, but all of those considerations have to be grounded in subjective experiences.
Okay, so what considerations are relevant?
So, well, the argument is that I, as an outside observer, cannot apply external standards to the victim in this situation because I'm not in their position. I have experienced the emotions.
So how do we pass a moral judgment on whether an action is right or wrong if we can't apply
If the individual
standards?
feels that they are acting in self-defense, then that act is morally permissible.
Okay, so let's look to the first justification for self-defense, the Wallerstein
Sure.
analysis. What does Wallerstein say?
So Wallerstein explains that the right to self-defense necessarily follows from the right to autonomy, insofar as autonomy is not important if we do not have the right to protect that autonomy.
Okay, so when is an individual's autonomy being violated?
Well, I would say that domestic violence is certainly a violation of autonomy.
Okay, can the threat of violence also be a violation of autonomy?
Absolutely.
How do we know when the threat exists?
Well, that's what the evidence of the affirmative contention speaks to,
Okay.
right? The contention 2 specifically talks about how even though these victims may not be experiencing like physical abuse, or even though they may not be in direct like danger of their life being taken, they're still experiencing psychological abuse that is just as bad.
So what you're saying is that the victim is always in some sort of threat or some sort of danger.
In the situation of domestic violence, yeah.
Okay, so the threat is always imminent.
Yeah.
All right. So let's look to the contention 2 subpoint B analysis on proportionality, or the preempt against proportionality. What does that analysis say?
The Kuhn analysis?
Yes.
Well, the Kuhn analysis explains 2 things.
Okay.
First, that domestic violence, or that self-defense in response to domestic violence would meet the proportionality standard, and second, that it would meet a standard of imminence.
Okay,
Don't we get to those individually?
What standard of proportionality does Kuhn's apply to?
Okay, so Kuhn's argument is that women in these situations are always in a constant state of their life being threatened, because if they try to leave the situation, they're going to be abused. That's what these statistics in Kuhn talks about.
Okay,
Most cases of domestic violence occur to women that have tried to leave the situation.
So how is deadly force proportional to psychological abuse, or say financial abuse?
Okay, so that's what the Kuhn evidence talks about, and that's also what the Ewing evidence talks about. So Kuhn's argument that it's proportional because these individuals are always in a state in which their life is being threatened. If they don't act, they may very well end up dead. The Ewing evidence speaks to psychological harms. Specifically, Ewing's argument is that even though these individuals may not be in a state where their life is being threatened, they're still experiencing psychological abuse that makes their life not worth living.
Okay, so the presumption is that deadly force is going to result always in the death of the abuser, correct?
Sure, that is presumed by the affirmative case.
Okay. I'll start that.
All right. Cool. So, I'm going to start the same place that Kelsey started in cross-examination. So, Kelsey asked, how do we know when an individual can act in self-defense? He said, what kind of moral judgment can we make? When can we make that judgment? And Brian responded, well, we look at the victim's perspective and we say, if the victim thinks that they were in danger, then we are going to trust the victim and allow them to stand as the only standard for self-defense. Now, do you think that Kelsey stood up and just looked down at her flow and was like, oh, what question will I ask? Maybe I'll ask about this subjective thing. Is that what Kelsey did? What did she do instead when she stood up in cross-examination? What did she do before she stood up? Exactly. She had in mind specific arguments that she wanted to go for, or things that she wanted to get out of cross-examination. So now let's ask why Kelsey would start there, and why her plan going into cross-examination was to talk about that argument. So Brian says self-defense has to be judged from the perspective of the victim. We can't impose external constraints. We have to just trust that if the victim feels threatened, then they are justified in acting in self-defense. Now, why might Kelsey care about this? What are some external constraints that we might want to impose on self-defense that Brian is saying we can't do? So what does the negative want to say you have to have in order for your action to be self-defense? Just in general.
Morality?
Let me reframe the question. So, what Brian's case is saying is we have to totally trust the victim. We can't evaluate the actions ourselves and measure up the actions. We have to just say whatever the victim did must have been fine because they're the only one who knew what was up in the situation. So, think about some common negative arguments. So take a second, think of some common negative arguments about self-defense. Now, which of those types of arguments can Kelsey not make if Brian's winning this argument? You already have an
She could make the argument that the victim is irrational.
Let's think about what types of arguments the negative can't make. So if we cannot stand from outside and judge whether we think the action, what we think of the response and the original action, we have to just totally trust the victim. Then, right here?
Disproportional?
Exactly, right. So we can't judge that the action was disproportionate because we have to totally trust the victim. Some other examples of negative arguments that couldn't be made are things like imminence. We can't judge from the outside whether the act was going to be imminent or not. We have to totally trust the victim because they're the only ones who have all of the information about the situation. Same thing with another type of argument that a negative might make, like alternatives. We can't say anything about that because we have to just totally trust that the victim has considered all the alternatives. So, why then would Kelsey start on this argument? Why did she talk about this first in cross-examination? Sam already did a good job answering the question. So can someone else say, why did Kelsey start here, given the implications it has? Ashley.
She found like a hole or like a flaw in his case, and so she wanted to like start there.
Right, specifically she found a place in his case where if there were a hole, then it would be a lot easier for her to make arguments. Because if Brian is winning this argument about subjective, then that means that she can't talk about proportionality and that sort of thing at all. So if she's beating Brian's argument, then it opens up this whole range of arguments that she couldn't make before. So that's why she started there. It was an essential part of the case. And the rest of Brian's case links into it because it says the victim does think that they are in imminent danger, regardless of what we think from the outside. Cool. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll see how the debate plays out.
Order of this speech is going to be the negative case and then on the affirmative stand. The value is morality. Human beings must have unconditional value because otherwise nothing would, and we would not have any ability to say that anything is moral. Immanuel Kant will explain the justification. In his analysis, he uses the terms objects of inclination. The phrase objects of inclination simply means things that we humans want to do or get. Kant writes, all objects of inclinations have only a conditional worth, for if the ones founded on them did not exist, then their object would be without value. Thus, the worth of any object which is to be acquired by our action is always conditional. Rational beings, on the other hand, are not merely subjective ends whose existence has a worth for us as an effect of our action, but things whose existence is an end in itself. Moreover, for which no other can be substituted, for otherwise nothing would ever possess absolute worth. If all worth were contingent, then there would be no supreme principle of reason. Man exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will, but must always be regarded as an end. To re-explain, Kant's first step is to say that any end has only the value given to it by humans. For example, the only reason why food has value is because humans like to eat when hungry. Similarly, a state of affairs is only valuable because humans want that state of affairs. For example, a situation where everyone has good health is only valuable because humans desire health. That means that if there were no humans, there would not be any value in the world. Kant's second step is then to ask if anything can be supremely good and valuable for its own sake. That is, whether there can be such a thing as morality. We already know that any end has any value because it has been given that value by humans. Thus, the only thing that could be supremely good is humans themselves. Therefore, if we were to have morality at all, it must be the case that humans are unconditionally valuable. Thus, the criterion is treating humans as unconditionally valuable. The only negative contention is that deliberate use of deadly force does not treat humans as unconditionally valuable. Nobody would wish a human to die if he thought that all humans were supremely valuable. It doesn't matter if the deadly force won't actually kill the abuser. Rather, the intent of the action itself is immoral. If humans are unconditionally valuable, then any action which doesn't respect that value violates the criterion, regardless of what the outcomes of the action are. Now on to the top of the affirmative case. Go to his value criterion of consistency with self-defense. In order for him to be winning the round through his own contention levels, he has to be demonstrating the value criterion. Group the first and second analysis, first and second justifications, because they're based on the premise that self-defense is necessary in order to preserve the value to life. I have two responses. First, this presumes that the individual is acting because they value life and not necessarily because they're only trying to achieve their own goals. This presumption is going to be flawed in looking into morality because he's only presuming self-defense is valuing the unconditional value of individuals without demonstrating that that's the actual intent of the individual in the first place. But second, this presents a moral paradox because it contradicts the value of individuals. To say that individuals could act by valuing life, but also preserving life, would mean that life would have no value if that life was lost in the first place. Now go on to the third justification, where he claims that if the government fails to actively preserve the life of individuals, then the social contract is broken. The flaw in this argument is that the social contract has no direct link to morality. If it were to have a link to morality, then it would be conflating the ideas of legality and morals, which are two separate ideas that must be made distinct. Now go on to the fourth justification, where he tries to claim that his analysis appeals to both utilitarianism and deontology. There's another flaw in this analysis, because self-defense cannot be compatible with util and deontology, because it allows us to violate the life of an individual while also trying to preserve a life. This means that we would be valuing one individual over another, which violates the premise that all autonomy is necessary, or all autonomy has worth. Now I'll go on to the observations. On the observation analysis, if he's not winning his standard, then he'll be trying to link it to the NC contention, or be trying to affirm by demonstrating how subjectivity is going to be necessary in order to say that deadly force is permissible. There are three problems with this argument. The first problem with this argument is that a subjective view cannot be evaluated with moral standards, because in order to have a moral standard, we have to have some sort of consistency in what we're saying is right and wrong in order for individuals to know how to act. The second problem with this is that he must be looking to other criteria in order to demonstrate self-defense. Remember, in cross-examination, he tried to claim that the threat of domestic violence is always present. This means that he's appealing to a standard of imminency. So that's the first thing he has to be proving. In order for him to be linking that to self-defense, he has to be proving that the threat actually exists. But second of all, another burden that he has to be proving is that the deadly force is proportional to the actual type of violence. It wouldn't be immoral for us to say that a person undergoing domestic violence that is financial abuse would be permitted to use deadly force in stopping that abuse. But third of all, he has to also prove that that is a necessary response. In order for him to demonstrate that there's a value to life, he has to say that the response is necessary and that other alternatives that are going to preserve both lives are not available. Remember, if he's not reaching his standards, then he has to prove that subjectivity, he's linking into his burdens of subjectivity. Now go on to the contention level to see how he's not doing so. On the first contention, the problem with this is that the perception of the individual can be flawed. Just because the victims are killing in certain circumstances where they perceive the threat to be imminent, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. The second problem with this is that empirics don't necessarily justify a moral stance or a moral permissibility of an action. If the victims are killing in certain instances, this doesn't necessarily speak to the morality of the action, but rather only speaks to what they are doing in those specific situations. This means that he's not meeting the imminency standard. Now go on to the contention 2 analysis on subpoint A. He tries to think of the psychological harm, that's the earring analysis. He tries to think of the psychological harm means that it makes it proportional. But the problem with this is that psychological harm doesn't necessarily mean that their life is being lost, whereas the abuser's life is always going to be lost, so it would be disproportionate. Now go on to the subpoint B analysis, which claims that the objective risk of death is going to be real. Subjectivity fails in this instance, so to check if the danger is real or not would be impossible because we're always appealing to whether or not the victim perceives the threat to be real. This means that he's not meeting the proportionality standard on the proportionality burden. Now go on to the contention 3 analysis. The contention 3 analysis explains how alternatives don't exist and the government is failing to protect the individual, so that gives them the right to act in self-defense. But he's not going to be meeting the necessity analysis on the standard because he's not going to be demonstrating how alternatives don't exist. The Domestic Violence National Institute of Justice on Domestic Violence explains. A recent study looked at the impact of civil protective orders for domestic violence victims in 5 Kentucky jurisdictions. Civil protective orders may cover various situations such as ordering an assailant to avoid a victim's home and workplace or preventing any contact with the victim. Findings from the study suggest that orders make a difference in safety, fear levels, and cost savings. Urban and rural populations reported significant differences in fear. Half of the women who received protective orders did not experience a violation within the following 6 months. This means that alternatives do exist to using deadly force, which would be more proportional than using violence in order to stop the domestic violence in the first place, so he's not meeting that criterion either. And now for cross-examination.
Ready? So you put 3 standards on me, right? The 3 bird flags: imminence, proportionality, and necessity.
Yes.
What happens if I show that self-defense is consistent with all 3 of those?
If you demonstrate that self-defense is consistent with those 3 criteria, then you can demonstrate that self-defense is going to be permissible.
Wait, so if I do that, do I win the round?
You're meeting the burden, so yes.
Awesome. So if I prove that self-defense is consistent with those 3 standards, that's sufficient for me to win the round.
Yes.
Awesome. Let's talk about the negative case. So the argument in Kant is that if morality is to have meaning, we must have something that is unconditionally valuable, right?
Yes.
So why would we presume that humans are the things to be unconditionally valuable?
Okay, so Kant explains that humans are what give other things worth. So the reason why food matters is because when I'm hungry, I need food. So if humans are able to give other things worth, that means that humans are the starting point of all value.
So what is it about humans that makes them the starting point of value?
The fact that we have the ability to give other things worth.
Oh, awesome. So what if something was to endanger that ability?
Then individuals would, or then that would be a violation of the fact that
Sure,
individuals have
but would we be
unconditional
justified in protecting that ability?
worth. In the way that you're trying to justify self-defense, you're assuming that any threat or anything that a person perceives as a threat is allowing that self-defense.
So
I'm saying that
is your
there's other
argument
criteria that we have to consider.
Is your argument that domestic violence is not an instance in which people's autonomy is being threatened?
My argument is that deadly force doesn't meet the criteria of making sure that it's a correct response to that.
So what are those criteria?
Okay, so there are 3 criteria that I put on the standard.
Well, no. Those don't have to do with the Kantian arguments that you're making, right? Those are
Okay.
external to the negative case.
Those are external.
I want to know, as for the negative case, what actions we can take to protect our autonomy.
Okay.
Because you seem to
the
say that
negative
autonomy is
case
really important.
simply says that whatever action you're taking to protect that autonomy, it can't undermine the unconditional value of an individual.
So what does that mean?
That simply means that we can't kill an individual because that would be violating their unconditional worth.
What if that individual has already lost their autonomy? Are they still valuable?
I
As
would
for the
say an
negative case?
individual who commits like a violation or like an abuser hasn't lost their autonomy simply because they've become an abuser. They still have that unconditional worth because they're human.
Okay, that's fine. So the second part of the Kantian argument, or rather the first part, says that if we are to value morality, if we are to care about morality, then this must be true, right? We must presume that humans are unconditionally valuable, right?
Sure.
So why is the first part of that necessarily true? That we care about morality? Why does morality have to have meaning in the first place?
So morality has to have meaning for both the affirmative and negative because the affirmative is trying to prove something is morally permissible. So in order to prove something is permissible under a moral framework, morality has to have meaning to it.
Okay. I'm sorry for that.
Ooh, the thought thickens. All right. So, what I'll first do is talk about the negative case to make sure you guys all understand the argument that's being made there. And then I'm going to talk about the strategy that Kelsey takes against Brian's AC. So, the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to briefly re-explain the argument that the negative makes in the Kant argument, and I'm going to ask one of you to explain it to me so that I know that you got it. So the argument that Kelsey is making in the Kant card that's at the top of her negative case is that everything in the world just has conditional values. So we only want food, or the only reason food has value is because humans want it. So, if we are to say that there is something that is supremely good, that is, if we're to say that there is something that is morality that's always good no matter what, we need something other than things like food or situations. So that means that the thing that has to be ultimately supremely good is human beings. Because otherwise, nothing would be good no matter what, and we wouldn't have the idea of morality. So that means humans have to be supremely good, which leads to the negative criterion of treating humans with unconditional worth. So now I'm going to call on someone to explain that argument to make sure that you guys got it, and then we'll move on. Purple Shirt McGee.
All right. So basically, her argument is saying that humans value, like the reason why things are valuable is because humans value that be valuable. They said they're valuable, therefore they must be valuable. And so the source of that is basically that humans, because humans compare conditional values, they have to value each other as unconditionally, right? And so kind of like the idea is that if we place a conditional value on life, then we're kind of like, it doesn't make sense. It's kind of contradictory to how we can value that someone, right?
And the reason that it's contradictory to say that humans have only conditional worth is because then we can't say that there's a thing such as morality, which is always good all the time. So if we want something that's always good all the time, it has to be us. Because everything else is only valuable because we like it. Good explanation. Nice. So now let's talk about now that you understand that, this was also from the ethics lecture that you guys had, so you're seeing the argument in play here. So now let's talk about the strategy that Kelsey took on Brian's case. So she, surprisingly enough, went right for the argument that she started for in cross-examination after she answered Brian's criterion. So she went to the argument, this is right before the first contention, on the observation about the criterion, the question of subjective or objective. So what she said is she argued against Brian's argument. Brian's argument was, again, we have to just trust what the victim is saying, we can't impose any standards on them. So what was Kelsey's first response to this argument? Carlos?
A subjective view that makes it so that you can't judge moral ethics?
Yes, that is the response she made. She said you can't judge morality from a subjective point of view because that doesn't give you the sort of universality that you need for a real moral standard. So she's arguing against what he has there in saying, no, 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 it doesn't make sense to say we just evaluate self-defense based on subjective views because subjective views aren't what morality is about. Okay. So then she does something that we could have predicted that she was going to do based on what we talked about. So this argument tries to get out of a bunch of, the argument that Brian's making tries to get out a bunch of negative arguments like proportionality, imminence, necessity. Curiously enough, those are exactly the arguments that Kelsey then goes on to make. So she makes how many arguments, how many things does Brian have to prove in order to be meeting the criterion of self-defense? And I accidentally held up my fingers when I was saying that, so you guys should all know it. So let's just get the fingers up. How many fingers? 3. Okay, Boy Scouts pledge. He has pledged, he said that he has pledged if he does all 3 of those things, that means he's meeting his standard. But what does that mean about if he misses one of them? He loses. Right. So what Kelsey's done is said, first, you're wrong about this subjective-objective thing. We have to be able to use objective standards. Then she gave 3 objective standards: proportionality, necessity, and imminence. And then said if he doesn't meet any one of them, then he's not showing self-defense. So even if an action was necessary, so I have nothing but a right leg and I have to defend against someone who is trying to attack me. So even if it's necessary for me to use my right leg, and that's the only thing I have, if it's not proportional, i.e. if they're just tickling me in the nose with a feather, then it still doesn't count as self-defense if I sock them in the balls. Okay? So that meets some of the standards, but it fails some of the other ones, so it wouldn't count as self-defense. And that's what Kelsey's saying. John, did you have anything to add?
Yeah. So another reason why the burdens that Kelsey sets up are necessary is you can think of the situation where maybe it's the case that a spouse threatens to kill their abuser, but if the spouse that's being threatened can call the police will take the wrangling spouse away, lock them in prison, and the person that was threatened will be safe, then it is not an act of self-defense if they choose unnecessarily to kill another person. So if Kelsey at the end of the round is showing that there is an alternative, that means that under the criterion of self-defense, you would still negate the resolution. So that's true for all the arguments. If Kelsey is showing that it's not proportional, then you would negate the resolution because it's not self-defense. If Kelsey shows that it's not imminent, then under the criterion of self-defense, you would still negate the resolution because it doesn't meet the criterion of self-defense. So Brian doesn't meet any one of those 3 standards, unless he argues differently, then you would negate the resolution under the criterion of self-defense.
Cool. The last thing that I'm going to talk about the responses that Kelsey made, are the first responses that she made to the criterion. So go on your flow to the first 2 justifications for Brian's criterion. So what Kelsey did here was she said, group these arguments together. So she attacked the first and second justification at once. And the way she did that is saying what they had in common. So she said the first and second justifications have in common this idea that if we want to have rules at all, we have to be empowered to protect those rules. And she said that's what the Wallerstein argument was talking about, and that's what the second justification about the collapse of morality was talking about. They both basically were saying we have to protect, if we're not allowed to protect life, we basically don't have the right to life, that sort of thing. And then she answered that together. So I just wanted to make sure you guys were clear that she was addressing all of the justifications for the criterion, but she was just attacking two of them at once by saying what they had in common and saying why that didn't make sense. Okay. So next, we're going to see how Brian deals with that.
All right, we're going to keep starting on the negative value criterion, then we're going to the affirmative case. Everyone ready? There are three responses to the negative value criteria. First, it's set up as a choice, i.e., if we were to care about morality, we must find something to be unconditionally valuable. However, here's where the assumption happens. The NC assumes that humans are what we're to find unconditionally valuable, but that's never justified. We could just as easily find something silly, i.e. ducks, unconditionally valuable, that would satisfy the conditions for morality outlined in the negative case. Second, the NC says that if we care about morality at all, we need to find something unconditionally valuable. But that presumes that we do care about morality in the first place. That infinitely is never justified in the negative case. Third, the number 4 justification for the standard in the affirmative case explains why under a deontological system of morality, i.e. the negative case, self-defense is perfectly moral. So, with that in mind, let's go to the affirmative case now, specifically that justification, and I'll explain its function. My argument is that self-defense is justifiable under a deontological framework. The reason why is because Kelsey says that killing generates a contradiction in terms of deontology. But my argument is that the difference between killing and self-defense is the intent behind the action. And she very clearly makes the argument in the negative case that what's really important is our intent as individuals. As such, my argument is not that it is okay to kill, but rather it is okay to protect the inviolability of life. That serves two functions. First, that means that her value criterion is no longer applicable. As such, I don't need to answer the contention level of the negative case. Second, this justifies the affirmative value criterion of the consistency with the right to self-defense. So you can extend the value criterion of the affirmative case. With that in mind, all I have to do is prove that the affirmative action is in fact consistent with the right to self-defense, and I win the round. With that in mind, let's do now the subjective considerations argument, which is the observation. My argument is that we have to consider the action of the resolution subjectively from the viewpoint of the individual being accused. Kelsey has two responses here. The first is that morality can never be subjective, but this argument just doesn't make any sense, and it's not even the internals of the argument of the affirmative case. Remember, my argument is that individuals that aren't in the situation don't have the relevant information to make the necessary considerations to determine whether or not an action actually is moral. The only way to make those considerations is to be the individual in that situation and have that knowledge. As such, morality is necessarily subjective. Her next argument says that there are these three standards of imminence, proportionality, and necessity that I have to meet. But these are inconsistent with the argument that I am making. Namely, these are all objective standards that we as external observers apply to the individuals in the situation. That means that those are not applicable to those individuals, so if I can show that they do believe themselves to be acting in self-defense, that's sufficient to affirm. With that in mind, extend the Saunders evidence. That says that individuals that kill only kill in extreme circumstances as far as they are concerned. Kelsey has two responses here. First, that perception is flawed, and second, that empirics aren't necessarily moral. However, the Saunders evidence very clearly answers both of these objections. It doesn't matter if the perception is flawed, that's what the subjectivity argument says. The second argument is just straight up wrong. My argument is that, if it is necessarily true that those individuals do believe themselves to be acting in self-defense, that's all that's relevant. However, even if subjectivity is not important, I can meet the standards she sets up for me as well. Go down to extend Q. This is going to meet the perception, or the proportionality and imminence standards. It meets the proportionality standard because Kuhn's argument is that these individuals are always at a risk of death. As such, they are perfectly justified in using deadly force. Second, it meets the eminence standard because Kuhn's argument is that these individuals are always in a situation in which they could be threatened with death. They can never get far away from that threat. The last standard is necessity. With that in mind, extend the third contention, which is the UN evidence. That says that in certain situations, individuals don't have access to alternatives. Her response to street evidence about Kentucky, they might have alternatives in Kentucky, but they don't have them in Sudan or other nations where the government is not looking out for their citizens. Those individuals don't have alternatives, and they deserve the right to self-defense as well.
Cool. So, let's start by figuring out the response. Let's start on the negative case again with the arguments there, so that you guys get an understanding of these arguments. We'll be focusing less on the content of these arguments in our lecture later, so this is the best chance to make sure you understand. So, remember our recap of the argument that Kelsey was making at the top of the NC last time. She was saying something has to be unconditional, so we have to have something unconditionally valuable, so that thing is going to be humans. What does Brian say could be unconditionally valuable instead of humans? Ducks, right. So Brian was pointing out a hole in the argument that Kelsey was setting up, similar to the way that you guys talked about identifying the premise that was missing and explaining why they can't meet it in your dismantling lectures. So he said there's no reason why humans have to be the thing that was unconditionally valuable. Moreover, there's no reason why they have to be. We could just choose anything at all, such as pretty ducks. Okay, so that's the argument he was making against the philosophy part of Kelsey's case. The next argument he was making was, remember, she was saying we have to care about, if we care about morality, then we have to use humans as unconditionally valuable. So what does Brian say in response?
Why would
it presumes we all care?
Exactly, you guys got it, yeah. So it presumes that we care about morality. Great, cool. So that is the negative case, and the last argument that Brian made was comparing the affirmative case to that. So we'll get that when we talk about the affirmative case.
Why did Brian say he wasn't answering the content of the negative case? He said something very explicit in the last one. Did he make any responses on the contention level of the negative case?
No.
No. He said why he was doing that. Did anyone hear why? Yep.
Because her value criteria wasn't legitimate, he didn't have to address the contention.
Right. So he's relying on the fact that he is going to show why his criterion of self-defense is the one that links better back to morality in the round. So the negative case is not going to matter.
So now we're going to quickly go over which arguments Brian extended so that I make sure you guys all have them properly marked on your flows. So, which justification for the criterion did he extend? Number. Oh, we have some disagreement. Okay. So, Brian extended a justification for his criterion. Who can raise their hand and tell me which number justification from the AC they think he extended? Albino? Yes. Brian extended the fourth justification. So make sure you have that on your flows, that is the one he extended. So then before we talk about the other content of the arguments, let's just figure out all the things that Brian extended. So Brian then went to the subjective-objective argument. And did Brian defend this argument? Yes, he did. Okay. So then, he extended an argument out of the affirmative case that linked into this idea that the way we determine self-defense is if the victim felt like they were in danger, then it counts as self-defense. We trust the victim totally, all that. So what was the name of the author that Brian extended? Saunders, from contention? One. Okay. Should you have that on your floor?
So the first argument that Brian extended was from contention 1.
Okay. So the next argument that Brian extended was the author, Kuhn, from where? Subpoint B of contention 2. Okay. It's very important that you have this clear and organized on your flow. Otherwise, you'll get extremely confused later on. And what was the last piece of evidence from the affirmative case that Brian talked about? From? Contention? Cool. Great. You guys are all master blowers. So now what we want to get down is the basic structure of Brian's rebuttal. We'll go over this more later on, so we just want to get the basic idea. So he started off by saying, I'm still winning this subjective morality argument because the victim is the only one that has all the information necessary to make the judgment in the moral situation. Then, Brian said, this is why, with Saunders, I'm meeting the idea of subjectivity, that we trust the victim's experience. Now, Brian made a strategic move after that to say, even if I'm not winning this subjective argument, I'm winning by doing what? So if he's not winning the subjective argument, how is Brian going to win? Meeting the standards. Great.
Wait, how does Brian meet the standard of proportionality? What piece of evidence did he extend that says meets the standard of proportionality? Kuhn. What argument did Brian extend that meets the standard of proportionality? That was Kuhn. What argument does Brian extend that meets the standard of that meets the burden of imminency? He said Kuhn, right? Yeah. Okay. What argument did Brian extend that meets the burden of showing that it is necessary that alternatives don't work? Right. So did he extend a piece of evidence that he said meets all of those burdens of self-defense? Yes. Okay.
Humans must be unconditionally valued, and that we could value something like a duck. But remember, the Kant analysis explicitly says that the reason why humans have unconditional value is because humans have the ability to assert worth onto other things that don't have unconditional value. This means that humans are the basis for value in the first place. So in order to make sure that we are preserving a moral framework, we have to be looking to what thing would provide for that morality, which means we're looking to individual humans. His second argument says that it presumes we care about morality, but in cross-examination, remember, I explicitly said that in order for something to be morally permissible, there has to be a moral framework to begin with, so of course we both appeal to morality. So now to his third argument. His third argument says that he's meeting the deontological framework and the util framework, but I'll explain how he's not meeting that later on. Extend the contention level of the NC, which proves that deadly force is going to be killing one individual, so it's not going to be respecting the unconditional value of an individual. This is an independent reason for you to be voting for the negative because I'm meeting the standard of the round. Let's look to why his standard cannot meet the value criterion his analysis cannot meet the standard of the NC. Go to his extension of his fourth argument on the value criterion, where he says util and deontology are applicable under self-defense. He claims that the intent of the individual matters, and that's how it makes it in self-defense consistent. But you can extend the first argument on the value criterion, which I explicitly said that presuming that the individual is acting in order to value life is going to be incorrect because we would be ignoring the exact reasons why the individual is acting in the first place, which means we can never really evaluate the intent of the action, so he can't be linking back to both util and deontology. So if he's not meeting his own standard in the round, he tries to appeal to the other criteria of burdens that I give to his observation analysis. Go there now. On the observation analysis, he claims that the only experiences that matter are subjective experiences. But you can extend the first argument I made that says a subjective view cannot be evaluated because morality requires us to give some sort of code of conduct on how we have to treat individuals. And if we look to a subjective view, then we can never determine a consistent way of treating individuals. So that means that things can't be morally permissible. if you're not buying the fact that I'm defeating his subjective view analysis, you can look to the reasons why he's not going to be meeting the burdens I set. Go there now. Go to the first burden that I set, where he has to be demonstrating how deadly force is going to, or that the threat is going to be imminent, so that is going to warrant deadly force. There's a specific reason why he's not going to be meeting that. Go to the contention 1 analysis. Extend my argument that says the perception of the individual victim can be flawed. This means that we can never really tell if the individual is going to be in a case where their life is going to be threatened. His analysis, he claims that his Saunders analysis says that the victim's perception of the death is necessary and that this is the only perception that matters. But remember, he can't be meeting imminency with a subjective appeal to the victim themselves. So that's the first reason why he's not meeting the criteria that he needs to be meeting in order to win the round. The second reason why he's not meeting the criteria is coming off the proportionality analysis. Remember, proportionality is going to be necessary in order to demonstrate whether or not the response that the victim is making is going to be proportional to the type of violence that is occurring. His extension of the Kuhn's analysis claims that the victim's response is going to be proportional because they're always at the risk of death. But remember, you can extend the argument on the subpoint A analysis, which says that the intensity of the violence cannot be checked if we're looking to subjective appeals. So he's not going to be able to demonstrate why that violence is going to be intense in the first place for that victim to respond in such a manner. It wouldn't be proportional to say that a victim undergoing financial abuse can simply kill their abuser, because that's not going to be meeting the proportionality standard, which he has to meet in order to fulfill the burdens. You can grant him the contention 3 analysis that says that alternatives aren't always going to be effective, and so he's meeting the necessity burden, but there's still 2 criteria that he's not sufficiently meeting, so he's not going to be winning the round. So let's look at how the negative is winning and how the affirmative is failing to meet the burdens. You're buying the negative standard over the affirmative standard because I'm demonstrating how if individuals have unconditional value, that we have to act in respect to this value, and in order to do so, we can't be using deadly force because deadly force kills an individual, which therefore does not claim that their value has worth. So now let's go on to the AC analysis. Remember, the second part explains how the affirmative standard is not going to be functional because he's appealing to subjectivity, which means that we can't evaluate whether or not the individual victim is actually going to be acting moral, because subjectivity is going to vary, so there's not going to be consistent standard of moral means. Then, the third level explains how he's not going to be meeting the burdens analysis even if you're not buying subjectivity and you're looking to an objective view, because 1, he's not demonstrating imminency. That was the argument on the contention 1 analysis, but 2, he's not demonstrating proportionality. That was the answer to the Kuhn's analysis. Even when he tries to claim that Kuhn's is demonstrating that the victim is always going to have a risk of death, remember, the only way to evaluate the risk of death would be to appeal to the subjective views of the victim, which is impossible. Thus, you can negate.
So, we've started on the NC enough, so I'm not going to do that this time. We're going to start on the affirmative. How many of the burdens that Kelsey puts on Ryan does she extend in this speech?
2.
Great. Which ones are they? Well, it looks like people decided to say either proportionality or imminence first. So it got jumbled, but I think those were the only words I heard, which was correct. Right, so Kelsey goes for those 2 burdens that she's putting on the affirmative and says why the affirmative can't get them. So, the way that Kelsey does that is by specifically going to the evidence that Ryan is trying to use to meet them and showing why they don't work. So, which piece of evidence is Ryan using to meet the proportionality standard? Great, so that's the one she responds to. So, let's take a look up at the standards debate, or look again at the observation just before contention 1. That's where the subjective argument comes, and then where Kelsey made the burdens arguments. So, Kelsey insists again that we can't evaluate based on the subjective views of individuals. Now, remind us, why does she make this argument? Right, so why does Kelsey still make again the argument that the subjective perspective of the victim isn't what matters in the round? Instead, it's these objective things. Ayush?
But there would be no constant way to evaluate morality? Something like that?
Yep, that's the warrant that she gives for the argument, and she needs to do it in order to be getting to those terms. Cool. So now let's take a look at the arguments on the negative case. Okay, so Brian's argument was you could just choose some particular thing as unconditionally valuable, for example, ducks. Kelsey responds, no, humans, we know that humans are going to be the thing that has value. And why are humans the thing that has value? So, one person. Priya.
Humans are the unconditionally valuable being because they are able to give other things worth.
Yeah, exactly. So if we start from this premise that there are things in the world that have value, and we know that humans give those things value, then we know that humans have to be the thing that is valuable. That's the argument that is ultimately supremely valuable. That's the argument that Kelsey was making in response to Brian's argument. So now what we're going to be looking for in the 2AR is how Brian is going to deal with these arguments. So Brian has to deal with this subjective-objective argument. He has to deal somehow with the burdens on the affirmative case, and he has to deal with the negative case. So what we're going to be looking for going into the 2AR is how Brian pulls that off.
All right. Like Devin, I will be starting on the affirmative case. Is everyone ready? Kelsey's only response to the fourth justification for the standard is that this presumes that individuals are acting in protection of their own life. However, this begs the question of whether self-defense is indicated by the question of the resolution. Obviously, if an individual is acting in self-defense, then by definition they are acting to protect their own life. My argument here is that self-defense is perfectly justified under a deontological view of morality because the intent is what matters. So I'm not justifying killing. I'm justifying the protection of everything that Kelsey says is really important in the negative case. So that means that if I can prove that affirming is consistent with the right to self-defense, that alone is sufficient for you to vote affirmative, and this takes out the negative value criterion. With that in mind, you can extend the affirmative value criterion of consistency with the right to self-defense. Now, let's go down to the subjective objective considerations argument. I will concede that we can impose objective considerations on individuals. Even if Kelsey's argument here is true, and I grant her that concession, I'm still going to be winning the round because she tells me in cross-examination that if I can prove that I am meeting these standards that she's setting up for me, I win the round. Remember, she concedes one of them, I am necessity, in the last speech. So, all I have to do is prove that I'm meeting the other two standards of imminence and proportionality. With that in mind, let's talk about why I'm meeting those standards. Let's start with proportionality. Kelsey's only argument on proportionality is that our perception is flawed. However, my argument, and fifthly the argument in Kuhn's, is not dependent on subjectivity or perception. So, instead Kuhn's, he says that realistically and empirically, these individuals are always under the threat of death. They are always in a situation in which their life is in danger. It's not that they perceive their life to be in danger, it's that their life is always in a precarious situation in which it could be lost at any second. So, that means that I am meeting the proportionality standard because Kuhn's argument is that these individuals, these victims, are in situations that justify using deadly force. Then, let's talk about the imminent standard. Kelsey's argument here is that intensity can't be checked. However, my argument is not talking about intensity. Rather, the arguments in Kuhn's talk specifically about individuals not being able to escape the threat of domestic violence in the first place. The specific warrant in Kuhn's says that most acts of domestic violence happen after separation has already occurred. So even if this imminent standard is true, an individual should just leave the situation, that doesn't solve the problem. So, Kuhn's is sufficient for me to A, meet the proportionality standard, and B, meet the imminent standard, which is all she says I need to do to win the round. So, here's how the round breaks down. First, the extension of the number 4 justification for the value criterion from the affirmative case takes out the negative value criterion. That sets up the fact that I just have to prove consistency with the right to self-defense, i.e. my standard. The way I do that is via the 2 standards that she sets up for me, eminence and proportionality. The Kuhn's evidence that I'm extending meets both of those standards, and she's just not adequately responding on either front. As such, I urge an affirmative ballot.
Cool. So the only thing that I'm going to say, because we're going to be talking about this later, is to point out what Brian did at the end of his speech there as a rhetorical thing. He went down his whole speech and said why he was winning at every point, and said what he was going to do to win. And then at the very end, after he'd been telling you why he was winning the whole time, he said, now, in case you guys didn't get it the first 5 times I told you, I'm winning, and here's why. And that is a great rhetorical tactic for you guys to use.